The introduction of the office of a permanently employed Baumeister or court architect at the German princely courts was the beginning of public building administration. Instead of being responsible for just one werk or work, like their counterparts, the Werkmeister or master builders at the urban cathedrals of the late Middle Ages, court architects were, according to their employment contract, responsible for all the Baue or buildings of their sovereign, namely for their constructions and maintenance. In addition to representative buildings, this included diverse types of economic buildings, defensive structures, and even roads and bridges. The contemporary German language architectural theorists, above all Rüff, Fortenbach, Sturm, and even Pender and Stieglitz, however, are all silent on the inspection, care, repair, and maintenance of existing buildings. Maintenance seems to have been the stepchild in normative sources of architecture in the early modern period, at least in Germany. All these treatises concentrate on design and implementation. The repair of existing buildings by other designers was thus not in focus. Only Johann Georg Grünitz's Ökonomische Enzyklopädie, whose work was also intended to reach people outside the circle of building experts, gives a few references around 1800. This is very, very late. Today's German language research literature has been increasingly concerned with the topic of maintenance for several decades, and more recently in the sense of sustainability. However, studies on its historical development in the building industry are still very rare. So, what sources can be consulted for the topic of maintenance? General building administration instructions with corresponding regulations are very rare to find. This is because they were usually not issued when building offices were founded, but only in the occasion of their restructuring from the 18th century onwards. This category includes, for example, the Reglement issued in Dresden in 1718 for Count von Wackerbart as head of the Sächsisches Oberbauamt, the Saxon Building Office. Other normative sources that were supposed to regulate the practice of maintenance could not be found either in the personal records or in the general finds on the organization of the building offices in the visited archives. However, chance finds in other archives and inventories cannot be ruled out. So we are hopefully. Employment contracts repeatedly contain more or less detailed instructions. Therefore, 225 employment contracts from various territories of the Holy Roman Empire between 1500 and 1800 were analyzed for this paper. This includes archival sources from major territories like Saxony, Brandenburg, Prussia, Bavaria, and Austria, as well as of minor cities like Württemberg, Ansbach, and Salzburg, of imperial cities like Nuremberg, Augsburg, and Esslingen, and last but not least of princely cities like Dresden, Berlin, and Vienna. The responsibility for all buildings, which always included maintenance for existing buildings or concrete regulations, was evident in 125 of 225 contracts. Thus, maintenance was one of the most important points in the employment contracts and one of the most important tasks for the entire building staff in the entire period under study. A close look at the regulations, however, reveals that in most cases, they hardly went beyond general phrases. In the 16th century, we find first regulations for this old problem with new challenges. In 1598, Peter Neurons, Generalbaumeister of Brandenburg, contract tells him that, no, it doesn't work. It works now, okay. That our buildings in Köln, fortresses, also our hunting lodges, and wherever else we will use his services, shall be subject to him. He shall inspect them diligently, and what new or old buildings need to be built or mended, he shall build or repair without delay. This responsibility for all buildings seems to have initially led to chaos in many places in the 16th century, because repairs were apparently carried out in an uncontrolled manner, and in some cases, new buildings were obviously also built without permission of the prince. There's no other explanation for the passage that can be read in many cases in the orders, which stipulated that nothing was to be built or repaired without a prior knowledge of the prince. From 1582 on, Anthony de Moix, Baumeister of Lower Austria, was therefore also supposed to, oh, it's very slow, I'm sorry. No, that's far. Okay. First visit and inspect those buildings in our principality and lands which are reported to him by the Lower Austrian chamber councillors as being in need of repair by horseback or in their orders, on their orders, in order to then see to it that they are strengthened and repaired in the necessary manner in good time. In Saxony, the procedure for the mason and construction leader, Christoph Dendeler, was regulated in great detail as early as 1568. His responsibility extended to all types of buildings and to all components and materials. For example, across all disciplines, although he could call in a carpenter. Inspection rounds at regular intervals were not provided for. Instead, when problems were reported to his superiors, he was to start the inspection on their orders, assess the damage, and propose appropriate measures. These measures, which he was to present in a cost estimate, were to be planned by him as sparingly as possible, but prevent further expenses so that demolitions and new buildings could be avoided if possible. The most detailed regulations are found in the 17th century, when the building administrations in many territories were massively enlarged and professionalized. Which buildings were enumerated was, of course, primarily dependent on the area of responsibility of the building official, or as in the following, the building office. The appointment of Antonio Viscardi as court architect in Munich in 1685, the organization and scope of activities of the entire building office was also regulated more comprehensively. Of the building components that were to be inspected, the roofs in particular were mentioned, for example, in Michael Döbel's employment contract as court architect of Brandenburg in 1667. The most precise enumeration of critical and susceptible building components, which are consequently to be inspected in particular, is given in Saxony by Baumeister Andreas Schwarze in 1617 and his successors in office. So here are mentioned foundations, walls, stonework, stanchions, beams, dams, half timbering, and roofs. Completely different buildings and critical components had to be inspected and checked in an imperial city like Nuremberg in 1656. The Anschicker, who held the function of a city architect in Nuremberg and managed the day-to-day business, was subordinate to the Baumeister. The latter was merely the building commissioner of the council, who presided over the building office and was the final supervisory authority. Together with the building commissioner, the Anschicker shall inspect the portcullis in the gates of the city every 2 years and check that it is in proper working order by means of the drop test. He shall also be sworn to diligently see to it that in winter the ice piles in front of the drop gates are maintained and repaired as required. He shall also maintain the same ice posts and all other posts and icebreakers of the bridges, as well as the posts in front of the beginning of the pipes through which the water of the Pegnitz is conducted towards the city fountains. He shall also see to it that the frozen ice is knocked off in the entire area of the river course within the city as often as necessary and possible, so that the city does not suffer any economic damage to the bridges and other facilities. From the previous examples, it can be seen that inspections should take place at least once a year, especially in critical weather, for example, snowfall or heavy rain and storms, generally in winter or at the beginning of spring. However, an example was also found from Salzburg in 1664, where the city master carpenter should inspect all the buildings in the city every month. The examples show that the responsibility for maintenance has always been committed to the all eyes principle. In many places, a matrix structure was established to be able to grasp all problems. The local building administrators and residents or users could report problems. In parallel, building experts such as court architects, land architects, and court craftsmen were sent on inspection tours or even inspection trips through the entire territory. In contrast, Baudirektoren or heads of building administrations and Oberlandbaumeister, which were head architects, and in the 17th century, sometimes still the prince himself, coordinated the inspections and sorted the repairs according to their urgency. The former can be clearly seen in the example of the building commissioner in Nuremberg, who was supposed to arrange the inspections and probably occasionally accompanied them, while the Anschicker carried them out with the building staff. Antonio Viscardi's employment contract as court architect in Munich in 1685 shows how repairs were prioritized and organized. If the inspection reveals structural defects that must be repaired in order to avoid greater damage, he shall prepare a reliable cost estimate for the individual repairs, including both the cost of materials and the cost of daily wages. He shall send this to the electoral court chamber, indicating which defects are most necessary to repair before others, and how many workers must be employed for this. Furthermore, he should indicate the order of the other building sites so that not everything is tackled at once, so that not too many people are employed unnecessarily. It is obvious that architects who came from artistic professions and had not been trained in building trades, such as Giovanni Nusseni in Dresden, Andreas Schlüter and Iosander von Goethe in Berlin, were not obliged to do so. Masons also had to look after roofs, not only carpenters, whereas stonecutters, who were only in rare cases still employed at court, were not called upon to carry out inspections and had sunk to the status of mere workstone manufacturers. In the 18th century, the main thing to note is in the maintenance regulations is that the range of building types to be visited broadened considerably as more schools, orphanages, and other social institutions were built. In many territories, fortresses, churches, and parsonages were also included. In the building office instruction Reglement, issued to Jean de Bot for the Sächsisches Oberbauamt of 1728, critical building components are listed that the building administration was allowed to repair without prior notification, but with a final documentation in a bureaucratically abbreviated emergency procedure. In the course of the 18th century, the regulations became more and more general. The The head architect oder Oberlandbaumeister Christian Friedrich Exner and most of his predecessors and successors, as well as the land architects who were subordinate to them, were only to have what is necessary for the conservation, repair, and prevention of damage to all buildings carried out. Neither the types of buildings, nor the critical components, the time intervals, nor the distribution of tasks among the personnel during inspections were regulated here. The building administration of the large territories of the Holy Roman Empire had become so professionalized in their structures, working methods, and effectiveness that the prince no longer had to make detailed regulations. Even if the sources for the 18th century flow more sparsely, there is no doubt that the procedures established in the 16th and 17th centuries were maintained. However, it was important that, as in all other areas of building administration, financial control was transferred to the financial administrations through comprehensive documentation obligations on the part of the building officials. Within the building administrations, the structures of the division of labor with regard to maintenance seem to have been further consolidated. The two preserved employment contracts of the conductors, who formed the backbone of the building administrations in Saxony, Brandenburg, Prussia, and later also in other territories as a kind of architectural trainee and construction leader, do not mention inspections or maintenance among their tasks, despite otherwise extremely detailed instructions. Unless coincidence plays a role here, or the fact that it was not written habit of their job profile, possible reasons could be, above all, their time-consuming assignment as construction leader for new buildings. Furthermore, a factor will have been that they were intended for senior positions in the long run, which would tend to be less occupied with this later in their careers. But last not least, they were newcomers to the profession who still lacked the practical knowledge and experience for vulnerable areas on the buildings. Although there are no sources for the course of inspections, there is an interesting regulation for the middle of the 18th century in Prussia, which provides information about the different categories of maintenance. There, a distinction was made between Flickbau, patch construction or upkeeping. These were repairs that the tenant had to carry out, and regularly at his own expense. And on the other side of Hauptbau, which means main or new construction of new buildings, which the costs were paid, where the costs were paid by the chamber. Patching or upkeeping, which the tenant had to do himself or had to contract out, meant trifles. Regular maintenance work and the replacement of single elements such as roof tiles, window panes, half timber and fillings, posts and poles and fences, sleepers and bridges, which could be repaired for less than 12 Reichsthaler. New construction, on the other hand, was defined as the rebuilding after extensive, unavoidable destruction by the natural elements of wind, water, and fire, of entire building components such as walls, windows, doors, fences, and dams. In the case of roofs, the loss of more than 100 roof tiles, or 120 wisp, or more than a quarter of the roof was considered the limit. In terms of age, the state took over the rethatching of thatched roofs every 20 years, whereby rotten sleepers, beams, and rafters were also replaced. They also, every 20 years, took over the relaying of ponds, renewing of dams and cattle paths, as well as tile stoves after 12 to 15 years. Windows were also done every 20 years, whereby the tenant had to hand over all panes, wind irons, and fittings for reuse. The distinction between repair and new construction was thus not based on the actual technical condition as revealed by inspections, but on empirical values about durability with good maintenance, practical reasonableness for the tenant, and cost control for the state. Here, therefore, purely economic reasons and not modern concepts of sustainability determined the definition of repair and new constructions. I come to my conclusion. The inspections should be done at least once a year at the beginning of spring. With regard to the building components, as was to be expected, the main focus was on the roofs, which the masons and not only the carpenters should pay attention to. Particularly telling were the regulations and appointments for the Sächsisches Oberbauamt, which showed that architects with artistic training were not called in for inspections due to a lack of knowledge. The building administration leaders were less obliged to carry out inspections than the middle class of court and land architects and master craftsmen, but not the conductors who had a lack of experience too. The all-eyes principle was constitutive. More experts could see or find problems arising more reliably. In general, in keeping with the Baroque principle of economy, importance was attached to repairing damage as quickly as possible before it became more serious. A legal source from Prussia from 1751, on the other hand, shows that in the Prussian domain system, repair and new construction were defined purely by economic interests. Maintenance was one of the most important points in the employment contracts and one of the most important tasks of all for the entire construction staff throughout the period under study. But it brought little prestige to the architects. Over this had the fulfillment of this task the potential to weaken the position of the architectural profession, which was in a delicate phase of professionalization between artist and building officer status in the Holy Roman Empire of the early modern period. Architectural treatises therefore completely ignore this field of activity. Thank you for your attention.